In a world hungry for true leadership, one man chose a different path. What happens when a leader, beloved by millions, decides to step away, not to abandon, but to fight for something even greater? This is the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the boy from Bobo Dioulasso who rose to become the beating heart of a nation. In a letter that shook the very soul of Burkina Faso, he revealed secrets, sacrifices, and a daring mission for Africa's future. If you believe in courage, dignity, and the unbreakable spirit of a people, stay with us because what you're about to witness is not just a farewell, it's a beginning. There are moments in history when time seems to pause, holding its breath before the world shifts forever. In the capital of Burkina Faso, under the heavy skies of an uncertain future, such a moment was unfolding. The Grand Hall of Kosiam Palace, usually vibrant with chatter and the rustle of official business, was transformed into a sanctuary of silence. Ministers, journalists, religious leaders, and community elders filled the vast chamber, yet not a single whisper dared disturb the suffocating tension. Everyone had heard the same whispers. President Captain Ibrahim Traoré had an urgent announcement, one so important that it had summoned the heart and soul of the nation to listen. From the farthest villages of the Sahel to the bustling streets of Ouagadougou, anxiety spread like wildfire. What could possibly bring such weight into this hall today? What words could make seasoned generals grip the arms of their chairs until their knuckles whitened, or cause religious leaders to bow their heads in silent prayer? Then he appeared. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had come to symbolize resilience for millions, entered the room. He wore his traditional uniform, impeccably clean and perfectly fitted. But it wasn't the uniform that captured the room's attention. It was his face, calm as always, but today carved with something deeper, an unspoken sorrow mixed with unshakable strength. The flag of Burkina Faso, vivid green and red with its proud yellow star, stood behind him, seemingly glowing under the pale palace lights, as if to remind everyone this was no ordinary day. This was a day that would be etched into the story of the nation. Traoré's hands, the same hands that had once blessed farmers' harvests, cradled newborns, and saluted fallen soldiers, now trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket. From an inner pocket, he withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was an ordinary letter in appearance, but the room sensed, with the intuition only moments of great consequence bring, that it carried the extraordinary. The camera zoomed in silently, capturing every breath, every subtle motion, as though even the machines understood the sacredness of the scene unfolding before them. He stood there for a moment, simply looking out at the sea of faces, a pause so long and delicate that some held their breath without realizing. Then he opened his mouth, and in a voice touched by vulnerability but girded with purpose, he began. "My dear people of Burkina Faso," he said, his voice trembling slightly before settling into a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat. "Today I stand before you not as your president, not as a soldier, but as Ibrahim, the boy from Bobo Dioulasso who once sat under the great baobab trees listening to the wisdom of the elders, dreaming of a future worthy of their stories." A hush swept the hall, deeper than silence itself. Traoré was not delivering a political speech. He was baring his soul. Outside the palace, thousands of citizens had gathered in public squares, eyes glued to giant screens, their faces flickering in the twilight. Children clung to their mothers' dresses, teenagers stood shoulder to shoulder, elders leaned heavily on their staffs. All waited for answers, all waited to understand why their leader's voice carried such heavy sorrow. Inside, the atmosphere became almost spiritual. The very air seemed charged, thick with emotion and anticipation. Some ministers lowered their heads, others fixed their eyes on Traoré as if by sheer will they could hold on to whatever strength he was about to give. And yet, beneath the sorrow, there was something more, something that shimmered just under the surface of his words, a promise, a secret, a coming storm. Traore's gaze swept the room, not as a ruler surveying his subjects, but as a son memorizing the faces of his family. His shoulders, once so straight and commanding, now carried the visible burden of his love for these people, for every farmer who sowed seeds in dry soil, for every mother who sang lullabies under a leaking roof, for every young soldier who stood guard in the unforgiving Sahel heat. When he spoke again, his voice grew stronger. "Today, I speak to you not from power," he said, "but from love." It was then, right then, that the first hints of unease spread across the hall. Faces tensed, hands gripped chair arms tighter, because deep down the people understood. Love, pure and fierce, sometimes demands sacrifice. But what sacrifice? Whose sacrifice? The mystery thickened. A masterstroke of storytelling in real life without any theatrics. Traore had turned the nation's heart into a single pounding drum of anxiety and hope. The letter in his hand fluttered slightly in the faint breeze from the palace windows. It was a small motion, almost insignificant, but it felt like the heartbeat of a nation trembling on the edge of revelation. Burkina Faso waited, and in that long breath between what was and what was to come, Captain Ibrahim Traoré prepared to change everything. As the heavy silence cloaked the room, Captain Traoré shifted his posture, standing taller, steadier. The boy from Bobo Dioulasso was ready to speak, ready to pull back the curtain of his life and show his people the roots from which his love for them had grown. "I am not a man born of privilege," he said, his voice a thread of sincerity weaving through the hall. "I am the son of simple parents, people who taught me that dignity does not come from wealth but from service, from honor, from walking the earth with a straight back and a clean heart." His words, humble and raw, gripped the audience with a kind of tenderness that no grand speech could achieve. He painted a picture of a childhood spent barefoot on dusty roads, chasing dreams beneath wide African skies, nights spent listening to the griots, the storytellers of his village, weave legends of ancient warriors who had once defied empires. "Under the shade of the baobab," Traoré recalled, "I first learned that a man's life is not measured by what he gathers, but by what he gives." He paused, letting that simple truth settle into the hearts of everyone present. In a world too often obsessed with possessions and positions, here was a leader reminding them of something deeper, something truer. Outside the palace walls, the streets of Ouagadougou were silent. But it was a living silence, pulsing with hope and fear. In distant villages where screens had been set up under open skies, farmers sat cross-legged on the ground, children huddled close, grandmothers whispering prayers into the night air. Traoré continued, recounting how he had not chosen the military because he loved weapons, but because he loved his people, because he could not stand by and watch foreign interests carve up the red soil of Burkina Faso, because every child's laughter, every elder's wisdom was worth fighting for. "I joined the army not to conquer," he said, "but to protect, not to gain, but to serve." His voice grew stronger, more resolute with every word. In that hall, in that moment, Captain Traoré was no longer just a man. He had become a living bridge between the past and the future, between the dreams of ancestors and the hopes of generations yet unborn. And yet, there was a storm brewing behind his words, an announcement waiting like a loaded arrow in the bow of history about to be released. Burkina Faso waited, and Traoré, the barefoot boy from Bobo Dioulasso, the soldier with a poet's soul, prepared to tell them why everything was about to change. The silence that cloaked the room now grew heavier, almost unbearable, as Captain Traoré slowly unfolded the letter in his hands. Every eye in the hall was riveted to him, every breath held captive by the tension. A single word from him now had the power to shift the destiny of a nation. And then it happened. "If I stand before you today," Traore began, his voice steady but charged with a raw intensity, "it is to tell you that I will soon take a new path, a path that leads beyond our borders." The words struck the room like a bolt of thunder splitting a clear sky. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Murmurs, barely contained, rose and fell like waves against a cliff. Some clutched the arms of their chairs, others simply stared in disbelief, too stunned to move. Was he leaving? For a fleeting second, fear gripped every heart. What would become of Burkina Faso without the man who had so fiercely defended its sovereignty? Who had reignited its pride? But Traoré, sensing the tremors his words had unleashed, raised a calming hand. "You deserve the truth," he said, voice stronger now, cutting through the rising tension like a blade of clarity. All of it. Outside the palace, thousands of citizens watching on massive public screens leaned in closer. In villages where electricity was scarce, radios crackled as families huddled together to hear every precious word. Inside the hall, Traoré's eyes swept the crowd. Ministers, generals, community leaders, each face a portrait of worry and uncertainty. He paused as if memorizing them, embedding the memory of this shared moment deep within him. "I know my decision will not be understood by everyone," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of hard truths. "Especially those foreign analysts who have never set foot on our red soil, who have never felt the heartbeat of our struggle." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall, quiet but unmistakable, for in those words lay a defiance that resonated deeply with a people long overlooked and underestimated. Traoré straightened, the fire returning to his gaze. "Let this be very clear," he declared, his voice firm enough to shake the very walls of the palace. "I am not abandoning Burkina Faso. I am taking on a greater mission. My decision is not about running away. It is about expanding our reach, protecting our future in ways we never thought possible." Gasps softened into murmurs of cautious hope. Faces that had been frozen in fear now began to thaw, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Traoré placed his hand solemnly over his heart, a gesture captured instantly by the cameras, transmitted in real time to every corner of the country. "My soul will never leave this land," he vowed. "I am a son of Burkina Faso until my last breath." Out on the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands stood still, some with tears shining in their eyes, others with fists clenched in solidarity. Across the Sahel, in tiny villages and sprawling towns alike, the same electricity of emotion filled the air. Inside the palace, the silence was now a different kind, not heavy with dread, but pregnant with expectation. Traoré spoke of the battles he had fought, not just against the relentless tide of terrorism threatening to drown the region, but against invisible enemies, the crushing weight of foreign interference, the silent stranglehold of economic sanctions hidden behind diplomatic smiles. "From the first day," he said with unwavering conviction, "I made every decision not for comfort, not for politics, but because I believed it was right." The room hung on his every word, cameras capturing the flicker of pride in the faces of seasoned generals, the silent nods of elder statesmen, the quiet prayers whispered by community leaders. He reminded them of his promise that if he ever left, it would not be in betrayal, it would be with purpose. He spoke of the sacrifices made, the sleepless nights, the constant threats, the weight of carrying an entire nation's dreams on his shoulders, and he spoke of the new frontier he intended to enter, a battle not of guns and borders, but of influence, diplomacy, and vision. Burkina Faso's battle would no longer be fought just on the dusty fields of the Sahel, it would be fought in boardrooms, international councils, in the very heart of the systems that had long ignored them. "I am not leaving to hide," Traoré repeated. I am leaving to open doors that have been slammed in our faces for generations." At that, a palpable shift occurred in the room. Faces that had been lined with worry now showed the first flickers of understanding and pride. Traore's voice softened, but its power only deepened. "Sometimes, to truly serve those we love," he said, his voice catching slightly with emotion, "we must step back and find new ways to fight for them." As he turned the page of his letter, a ray of sunlight pierced the tall windows of Kosiam Palace, casting a golden glow around him. It was as if destiny itself had chosen this moment to bless his words. Burkina Faso waited, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré, with the weight of a nation behind him, prepared to unveil the next great chapter of their shared destiny. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows bathed Captain Traoré in a warm, almost ethereal glow, as if nature itself had paused to witness the birth of a new era. With the weight of revelation settling into the room, he lowered his gaze back to the letter and began to read. "What I'm about to tell you has never been said before," Traoré declared, lowering his voice to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall. The intimacy of his words drew the listeners in closer, hearts pounding, breaths caught in anticipation. "These past months," he continued, "while our soldiers fought bravely in the fields, I was engaged in another battle, a silent battle, just as crucial." Murmurs flickered like candle flames throughout the hall. What battle could he have been fighting, hidden from even his closest advisors? Captain Traoré's eyes shone with fierce pride as he revealed the secret that had weighed so heavily on his heart: the creation of a new African International Council. A council, he explained, composed of nations who have pledged to protect our food, our energy, and our future together without interference. The words hit like a lightning strike. This was no retreat. It was a revolution in diplomacy, a new front in the battle for Africa's dignity. Traoré explained that this council would not beg for seats at foreign tables, but would build its own. A council with the power to negotiate, to defend, to uplift, without being filtered through foreign lenses. "I have accepted a role within this council," he announced, his voice resonant with quiet power. "Not to escape my duty to Burkina Faso, but to fulfill it on a greater scale. From there, I can fight for our rights, for our land, for our children's future, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all the Sahel." The hall was stunned into silence. Journalists who had been ready to scribble frantic notes now simply stared, too moved to move. Ministers exchanged glances, heavy with realization. Generals' eyes glistened, recognizing the strategic brilliance of the move. Outside, in the squares and fields of Burkina Faso, the crowd watching the live transmission erupted not into cheers, but into a kind of solemn, sacred awe. Traoré allowed a small, rare smile to curve his lips. "While many speculated about my plans," he said, "we were quietly laying the foundation for something bigger than any one man, bigger than any one country." He spoke of a project already set in motion to send 500 of Burkina Faso's brightest young minds abroad for training: engineers, doctors, agricultural scientists, and teachers. Young men and women who would one day return not just to survive, but to build, to lead, to thrive. "From every province, from every walk of life," he said proudly, "we have chosen them for their brilliance, their dedication, and their love for this land." In that moment, Traoré was no longer simply a leader. He was a gardener, planting seeds of hope in the fertile soil of the nation's youth. Some ministers exchanged shocked glances. How had such massive plans been set in motion without leaks, without rumors? The precision, the care, the vision, it all spoke of a leader who thought not just of days or years, but of generations. Captain Traoré's tone grew more solemn as he addressed the transition. "Yes," he acknowledged, "I will step away from the presidency for a time. But know this: Everything has been prepared. He explained that a transition government, composed not of political favorites, but of proven patriots, would soon be announced. A government built on skill, honesty, and the relentless pursuit of the people's good. The names will be revealed soon, he assured, after deep consultation with our elders, our warriors, and our wisest minds. His voice rose again, strong and clear as a bell. "What I plant today," he said, his words almost a chant, "you will harvest for generations. Our patience will bear fruit. Our courage will be honored." Another shaft of sunlight broke through the windows, illuminating the golden dust motes swirling in the air like spirits dancing to his vision. He spoke next of the bitter past, the years when Burkina Faso had been exploited, sidelined, its resources plundered, its people left voiceless at world councils. "Today we are respected," he said simply, a quiet pride in his voice. But that respect was not given, it was earned through pain, through sacrifice, through unbreakable dignity. The hall, the streets, the fields, everyone listening knew this was true. They had lived it, they had bled for it. And now Captain Traoré was asking them not to mourn his departure, but to carry forward the torch he had lit. As he finished this part of his address, he lifted his head, his voice soft but unyielding. "My departure is not a retreat," he said. "It is a strategic advance, like a lion who leaves the pride for a time only to find new hunting grounds for his family." This image, raw, proud, deeply African, brought soft smiles to the faces of some traditional leaders. It felt right. It felt true. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, not as a man stepping down in defeat, but as a warrior stepping forward into a greater battle. Burkina Faso listened, and in the silence that followed, their hearts beat louder than ever. Captain Traoré paused for a moment, allowing the magnitude of his previous revelations to settle into the bones of the room. His gaze swept slowly over the faces of those gathered, as if searching for something beyond words, the silent agreement that they were ready to bear the weight he was entrusting them with. When he spoke again, his voice softened but carried even more gravity. "Now," he said gently, "allow me to speak not of missions or councils, but of something even more important, the soul of leadership." The hall, which had already been suspended in silence, seemed to deepen into an even more profound stillness. No one moved, no one blinked. It was as if every heart there had instinctively understood that what was coming next would be etched into them forever. Traoré's hand, still holding the letter, now rested lightly against his chest. "Leadership," he said slowly, "is not about giving orders. It is about carrying the hopes, the fears, the dreams of millions, and doing so with humility." The traditional elders in the room nodded quietly, their weathered faces reflecting generations of hard-earned wisdom. Veterans of battles long past exchanged glances, seeing in Traoré's words the mirror of their own sacrifices. He spoke of the lessons that had shaped him, not the ones learned in war rooms or political assemblies, but the ones etched into his heart by the people he served. "I have seen mothers carry children for miles through deserts just for a single chance at a better life. I have seen farmers plant seeds in cracked earth with nothing but hope and faith. I have watched young soldiers stand their ground against terror, knowing they might never see another sunrise." His voice wavered slightly, but never broke. It was a voice that carried the collective weight of thousands of unseen, uncelebrated sacrifices. "Power without kindness," he said, his voice deepening, "is nothing but cruelty, dressed in fine clothes." A ripple of emotion passed through the hall. Some closed their eyes, allowing the truth of his words to sink into their souls. Traoré continued, recounting the moments that had tested him most, the late nights burdened with impossible choices, the friends and comrades lost to battles fought in the dust and the dark, the despair that sometimes threatened to break even the strongest hearts. "I am not perfect," he confessed, his honesty sharp and brilliant as a blade. "I have stumbled, I have doubted, I have at times lacked patience or diplomacy. But through it all, I never lost sight of why we fight, why we sacrifice, why we endure." Outside the palace, in the fields and towns of Burkina Faso, his words traveled like fire across dry grass, igniting a blaze of understanding and connection. He spoke of dignity, not as a grand concept, but as a living thing nurtured in classrooms, in humble homes, in the battered marketplaces where people refuse to bow to despair. "Real freedom," he said with quiet passion, "is born not on the battlefield, but in the minds of educated children." He detailed the new schools that had been built in the remotest parts of the country, the scholarships granted to children who had once only dreamed of touching a book, the technical training centers rising from the dust like promises made flesh. "Educated people cannot be enslaved," Traore declared, his voice ringing with certainty. "And educated people will write their own destiny." The pride in his tone was unmistakable when he added, "If today I am respected beyond our borders, it is not because of my titles or medals. It is because I carry the wisdom, the resilience, and the courage of every man, woman, and child of Burkina Faso in my heart." Tears glistened openly now in the eyes of many. Even the most stoic among them were moved by the sincerity of a man who had never placed himself above the people, but had walked among them, learned from them, fought for them. "I leave with tears in my eyes," Traore said, his voice soft but unbreakable, "but with hope burning in my heart, because this is not goodbye. This is the start of a new chapter, a chapter that all of us will write together." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden rays through the palace windows, the atmosphere shifted once more. It was no longer heavy with sorrow. It shimmered now with a fierce, determined hope. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, a living symbol of the kind of leadership the world so desperately needed. Leadership rooted not in ego, but in service. Not in domination, but in compassion. Not in fleeting power, but in enduring love. And as his people listened, they knew they were not being abandoned. They were being called to rise. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the Kosiam Palace in a warm, almost ethereal glow. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center of it all, a calm force against the tide of emotion now surging through the room. His letter had nearly reached its end, but his message was just beginning to bloom in the hearts of his people. "This new chapter does not depend solely on me," Traoré said, his voice carrying the firm conviction of a man who truly believed in his people. "It depends on each and every one of you. Your vigilance, your courage, your unwavering commitment to the ideals that bind us together." He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with elders, soldiers, students, ministers, all gathered under the same roof, breathing the same heavy but hopeful air. "I have always said," he continued, a faint but genuine smile breaking across his face, "I am not a savior. I am merely a servant of this extraordinary people." For the first time that day, a wave of soft smiles, nods, and even quiet chuckles rippled through the crowd. The tension that had gripped the palace began to loosen, replaced by a warmth that was palpable. Traoré's smile widened slightly, the human vulnerability in him shining through his otherwise stoic facade. "And that is why I leave in peace," he said, "because the true strength of Burkina Faso has never resided in one man, but in the unity of its people." Outside, on the vast public squares and dusty roads where citizens huddled around radios and screens, spontaneous cheers erupted. It wasn't the raucous celebration of conquest, but the solemn, joyous cry of a people awakened to their own power. He spoke next of the pride he felt whenever he saw the Burkina Faso flag raised among the nations of the world. He remembered how just 5 years ago their presence was often overlooked, their voices dismissed. 5 years ago, they looked down on us, he said, his voice thick with memory. Today, they listen when we speak. He paused to let the truth of those words settle, not in arrogance, but in the quiet dignity of a people who had reclaimed their place in the world through resilience and self-respect. You earned this respect, Traore continued, his voice now brimming with pride, through your strength, through your dignity, through your refusal to bow to those who would dictate your destiny. He revealed, almost casually, that he had been offered high-ranking positions abroad, comfortable, prestigious roles in glittering cities far from the dusty plains and relentless challenges of his homeland. They offered me titles, salaries, comforts beyond imagining, he said with a wry smile, but I was never tempted. There was a murmur of approval throughout the hall, a collective affirmation of the man they knew, the man who had chosen dust over diamonds, struggle over luxury. I was not made for foreign palaces, Traore said, his voice swelling with emotion. I was shaped by the dust of Ouagadougou, fed by the hopes of my people, and raised by their struggles. Those words, simple yet powerful, resonated far beyond the palace walls, across villages, in cities, and even among the diaspora watching from afar. Hearts swelled with pride and a fierce, protective love. Captain Traoré was not just their leader. He was their brother, their son, their reflection. He closed the letter, folding it carefully with hands that now trembled, not with fear, but with the magnitude of the moment. Our story is still being written, he said, stepping away from the podium to address the room without any barrier between him and his people. And it will be written by you, the farmers who refuse to let barren soil defeat them, the teachers who light the flame of knowledge in every village, the soldiers who stand guard under the merciless sun, and the children who dare to dream even when the world tells them not to. His voice dropped to a near whisper, forcing the audience to lean in, to cling to every syllable. This is not an end, he said. This is a beginning. He placed a hand over his heart once more. I leave, but my heart remains. I step away, but my spirit marches with you. As the final words echoed through the great hall, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward a future still unwritten, but gleaming with promise. The hall erupted into a standing ovation, not loud and riotous, but sustained and powerful, a thundering, rhythmic applause that spoke of unity, of gratitude, and of a shared vow to honor the path their leader had charted. Captain Ibrahim Traoré bowed his head once, deeply, humbly, and then turned to walk away, not into the sunset of defeat, but into the horizon of a new shared destiny. And as he disappeared from view, Burkina Faso stood taller, prouder, and infinitely stronger. Their story was just beginning. In a world hungry for true leadership, one man chose a different path. What happens when a leader, beloved by millions, decides to step away, not to abandon, but to fight for something even greater? This is the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the boy from Bobo Dioulasso, who rose to become the beating heart of a nation. In a letter that shook the very soul of Burkina Faso, he revealed secrets, sacrifices, and a daring mission for Africa's future. If you believe in courage, dignity, and the unbreakable spirit of a people, stay with us, because what you're about to witness is not just a farewell, it's a beginning.